Thank you, James. Thank you, Pastor Douglas, for doing this. Before I start with the main line of argument, I want to clear up one possible source of confusion. I'm an atheist, obviously, and I'm here to defend the moral honor of atheism. But what I'm not is an anti-theist. I'm not here to besmirch the moral honor of theism. In fact, even though I'm an atheist and more than enough of a philosophy nerd to thoroughly enjoy arguing about topics like theism versus atheism, in the past, I've largely avoided this topic in public debates like this for the simple reason that I spend most of my time arguing about politics, and I don't want to give anyone who knows me from those contexts the impression that there's an anti-theistic component to what I advocate politically. There isn't. While I'm an atheist, and I clearly don't think that my being an atheist puts me at any sort of disadvantage in talking about morality, which is what we'll be discussing tonight, I deeply admire the Christian left, figures like Tony Benn or Cornel West, or just to pick a third progressive Christian at random, my wife, Jennifer Burgis. So that's not the point, right? I think that like people like Robert E. Lee, who fought for what I regard as the most evil cause in human history, was a Christian, but so was John Brown. So it's clearly possible to be on the right side of history and disagree with me about metaphysics. All I need from anyone politically is that they don't have any interest in trying to impose their religious beliefs on others. All right, that extended bit of throat clearing out of the way, let's get to the main event. I became interested in doing this debate because I have read and watched Pastor Douglas say that without theism, it's impossible to have what he will call authoritative morality, as opposed to just statements of preference. Sometimes this seems to be a claim about moral motivation, that without a divine enforcer to reward or punish people, they don't have a reason to act morally. To the extent that this is the claim, I think that's wrong in multiple very deep ways, and I'm sure we'll get to that later on. But in the limited time I have for this opening statement, I want to focus on what I think is the main claim being made. So Pastor Douglas is a presuppositionalist, meaning that he thinks it's impossible for theists and atheists to debate on neutral ground. You have to assume something about the existence or non-existence of God to get started. On the face of it, you'd think that this would make debates like this one impossible. The reason it doesn't is that, as any good philosopher or logician should be able to tell you, one of the best ways to argue against any position is to assume its presuppositions for the sake of argument and derive unsavory conclusions from them that don't follow from your view. I take it, is what Pastor Douglas is doing when he criticizes atheists as being unable to make sense of the idea of authoritative morality, by which he usually seems to mean, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, objective morality. And while I do think it's entirely possible to have an argument between atheists and atheists on neutral ground, certainly on many subjects, that way of framing it is one that I'm perfectly happy to use as far as we conduct tonight's debate. And I want to make two very simple points here. These are going to be my two big claims. The first is that on the presupposition that there is no God, there are plenty of philosophical options for making sense of the idea that morality is not relative to time, place, or culture, or relative to individual preferences, but that right things would be right even if no one ever knew that they were right, and wrong things would be wrong even if no one ever knew that they would be wrong. So, for example, you could be an atheist utilitarian and believe that whatever maximizes well-being and minimizes suffering is objectively right, no matter who does or doesn't think it's right. You could be an atheist Kantian and believe that treating other people as mere means to your ends is objectively morally wrong, no matter who does or doesn't think it's morally wrong. You could be an atheist Rawlsian and believe that whatever society perfectly rational people would decide if they knew they had to live in it, but they didn't know whether they were going to be born black or white, male or female, rich or poor, is objectively a just society, even if no one considers it just. So that's the first point. Now, maybe you don't find any of these options plausible. Maybe you think, as many philosophers, including some atheist ones, have, that there's a deep philosophical problem with making sense of the idea of objective morality, of what would that even mean for morality to be objective? Well, if you think so, that brings us to the second point, which is this one. If it's a big philosophical problem, how to make sense of objective morality, accepting for the sake of argument the presupposition of theism does literally nothing to solve that problem. It doesn't help in any way. The view that it would help at least its purest form, is called divine command ethics. The divine command ethicist says that morality isn't about what the utilitarian thinks it's about, maximizing well-being and minimizing suffering. It's not about not treating people as mere means like the Kantian thinks. It's not about what the Rawlsian thinks it's about. It's about doing whatever God commands. And there's a very simple and totally unsolvable problem with this moral framework, one that has been well known philosophically for thousands of years, and one which has convinced even many thoughtful Christian philosophers who know about it that divine command ethics must be the wrong way to think about morality. Now, I could see somebody watching this and say, how can you be a Christian and not be a divine command ethicist? We'll get to that. But let's talk about the argument itself. It's called the Euthyphro objection. Euthyphro, I never trust my Greek pronunciation, which to divine command ethics, and it comes from a dialogue written by Plato a little over 23 centuries ago. In the dialogue, Socrates is arguing with a character named Euthyphro about whether holiness can be defined as that which the gods love. Socrates asks him whether the gods love what they love because it is holy, or whether the holy is holy because gods love it, because the gods love it. Translated Socrates' challenge into the terms of tonight's debate, the question is whether what God commands us to do is morally good because God commands it, or whether God commands it because it's good. So start with the second option. If you say that God commands it because it's morally good, then you've just stepped out of divine command ethics. You've just accepted that it's good for some reason other than that God commands it. If, on the other hand, it's morally good because God commands it, then you have this problem. If God hypothetically had commanded you, thou shalt kill whosoever shall annoy you and rape whosoever you shall lust after, and thou shalt not under any circumstances be kind or charitable or help little old ladies cross the street, then you would have to say that murder and rape would be good, and charity and kindness and helping little old ladies cross the street would be morally bad. That's absurd. And note that it's absurd in exactly the same way that moral relativism is absurd. It's absurd in exactly the same way that it would be absurd to say that if the Nazis had won World War II and killed everyone who disagreed with their actions, or brainwashed everybody who was left to think that exterminating Jews was morally right, then it would follow that from that, the exterminating Jews would be morally right. If you think that's absurd, in exactly the same way, you should think that thinking that murder and rape were morally right if they'd been commanded by God would be morally good. In fact, the more we think about this objection, the more that we can see that divine command ethics is a form of relativism. It says that morality is relative to God's arbitrary preferences. And a quick word to any Christian viewers who may be encountering this argument for the first time: if what you're thinking right now is, oh, but God wouldn't command these terrible things because those things are bad and God is good, you've just rejected divine command ethics. If God wouldn't command them because they're morally bad, then their moral badness must be logically independent of God's commands. This is why philosophically sophisticated Christians understand that to make sense of the idea that God's commands are objectively good, they have to give up divine command ethics and say that God commands good things because they're good, not the other way around. They could still say that reading the Bible or praying for guidance is a good way to find out what's good and bad, because God, on their view, is all-knowing, and so, of course, he would know all the moral facts as well as all the other kinds of facts. But whatever you think of that claim, it's a completely different claim than saying that God's will is what makes morally good things morally good and morally bad things morally bad, which I think is what Pastor Douglas is going to need to say in order to make sense of the idea that it's impossible to make sense of objective morality on the presupposition of atheism. Now, some people who want to hold on to divine command ethics think that it somehow helps to start talking about how God's commands aren't arbitrary because they flow from God's nature. Trust me, that won't help. The reason it won't help is because it leads to the exact same problem again. It just pushes it one link up the chain. So the question now, if God's nature is kind and merciful and steadfast, is, okay, what if God's nature had been cruel and capricious and unforgiving. Would that therefore be a morally good nature? In other words, is what makes kindness and steadfastness and forgiveness good the fact that that happens to be God's nature, or is that God's nature because God is a morally good being? It's exactly the same problem. Now, I think we could follow this thread of argument up a lot more. I'm sure that we will. We get to the open dialogue portion of the evening. I also really hope when we get to the open dialogue, we talk about this business about moral motivation, because again, sometimes it seems to me that that is what Pastor Douglas seems to be talking about when he uses this phrase, authoritative morality. But if we don't get to those two subjects, somebody please ask about them in the Q&A, because I really want to talk about both. But right now, I've probably been going on long enough for the opening statement. So, Pastor Douglas, the floor is yours.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.